Okay, moving on to the next segment of today's show. I was doing a little bit of research on the college basketball season for next year, and I came across the SEC. And I did have a couple observations about the SEC, and there are a couple things I wanted to say about the SEC in 2021. And to start off, in 2020, I'll fully admit, not only was I very high on the SEC, but I thought it was going to be one of the better leagues across college basketball. And the bottom line is, it wasn't. Kentucky was really the only team that lived up to their preseason expectations, as besides them, there were a lot of other very disappointing teams. You look at the league, you have to start with Florida. I predicted Florida to be a top 7 team in college basketball going into last season. And we're going to talk about the 2021 Gators in a little bit, but Florida was very disappointing last season. They would have made, according to most bracket projections, the tournament last year as like an 8 or 9 seed. But when you look at their resume closer, I don't really understand why that is. So, yeah, but at the same time, on paper, their roster did look really good last year, and Mike White really did underachieve. You could, tell my opinions on Mike White by listening to the segment from earlier in the show. But Florida really did underachieve. Auburn overachieved, especially early in the season, but I think that could have maybe raised their expectations to be a little too high as they kind of fell down back to earth a little bit as the season went on. But they still had a productive season. I mean, had some big wins. I think they were a solid second or third team in the league last year. But even a team like LSU, who would have made the NCAA tournament, they were good, but they just weren't as good as they were the year prior, and they were very inconsistent. Same with Arkansas. That was a team that for most of the season did overachieve, but as the season went on, I think they kind of ran out of gas a little bit. Alabama really did struggle with injuries. Tennessee was another team that really did struggle with injuries, and once they hit their peak, I did think that was a little too late for them to, make a big run. I think Mississippi State, you could even make an argument, was a little disappointing. They had a bunch of talent, and they couldn't secure an NCAA tournament bid if it would have happened. Same with Missouri. They had talent, couldn't do anything. I know a lot of people were a little high on them before the season started. Bama struggled with injuries. So there were just a lot of teams where in the SEC last year that really did struggle. But when I look at the Southeastern Conference for 2020-2021, I actually think the league is in for an improved bounce-back season. And you guys remember a couple years ago, I was kind of on the bandwagon of, all right, even though the SEC is really known to be a football conference, I actually think the league could be pretty good in basketball next year. And I think what happened was when the SEC network launched, the commissioner of the league just decided to say, hey, we really have to prioritize basketball. You guys remember 7-8 years ago, how many basketball teams in the SEC were just not only bad, but irrelevant and awful and didn't really have any purpose of being there. Like Mississippi State and, Vanderbilt still kind of is. Georgia still kind of is. But, teams like that, Bama was irrelevant. LSU for a time was irrelevant. South Carolina, before they made their Final Four, was irrelevant. Ole Miss, teams like that were just teams that no one really cared about. Auburn as well. And then all of a sudden there was a little bit of a revolution. Alabama decides to bring in Avery Johnson, who wasn't great, but, turned the program around. Arkansas decided to get rid of Mike Anderson and bring in Muss, who looks like to be a very good hire. Auburn brings in Bruce Pearl. LSU brings in Will Wade. Missouri brings in Konzo. Tennessee brings in Rick Barnes. Florida brings in a guy they at least thought would be good in Mike White. A&M brings in Buzz Williams. So as time's gone on, the coaches in this league have been getting better and better. And I think when I look at the SEC specifically in 2020, 2021, the league is going to be in for a bounce-back year. And I think they're going to be in a good spot to get 7 or 8 maybe teams in the NCAA tournament, because all those teams and all the teams we're going to be talking about today, I think have potential. And that is really why we're going to be talking about them. So I'll start off at the top. Kentucky, that's the team in the SEC when you hear people talking about the conference that everyone starts off with. And when I look at Kentucky for next season, a lot is going to depend on Olivier Sarr and if he's ruled eligible or not. But at the same time, I don't see why he would have transferred to Kentucky from Wake Forest if he wanted to sit out a year and he wasn't eligible, because I think if that was the case, he just would have went pro already. So you combine him with the two-star freshman BJ Boston and Terrence Clark, along with Keon Brooks, who was pretty good for Kentucky under the radar last year. Davion Mintz will be there. You also have Devin Askew and Isaiah Jackson, the other freshman. So I think Kentucky will be at the top of the SEC. John Calipari is an underrated in-game coach. I will continue to say that. He doesn't get enough credit from most college basketball fans from the amount of winning he's done over the last couple seasons. So Kentucky's going to be right in the mix. I am very high on Tennessee. You know, they returned everyone from last year's squad besides really Jordan Bowden. I think with their core of Fulkerson and Yves Pons and Vescovi, you know, they have plenty of experience, and you guys know experience is a big key for me when I'm looking at which teams in college basketball do I like going into the following season. I look at coaching and I look at experience, and Tennessee is a team that has both of those things with Rick Barnes, an underrated coach, a guy that, even though Tennessee didn't live up to their preseason expectations last year, I would actually make the argument that Rick Barnes had a very encouraging coaching season due to the fact that he had a lot of young players, developed them, they got better as the season went on, and you know, when you're a consistent, good program like Tennessee has been, and you have one bad year where you miss the NCAA tournament and things just don't go your way, like Jordan Bowden or like Lamonte Turner getting hurt early in the season, then stuff like that happens. And it all depends on how you really build the trajectory of your program. And Tennessee is another team that easily could have just quit on their coach last year and just said, you know, screw it, we're not going to be any good, why even try? But they did build some momentum going into next season with Vescovi and their young core. I think Tennessee is going to be really good next season. Another team I really like in the SEC next season. How about Alabama and Nate Oates, their coach? I think Bama's going to be really good. Unfortunately, it was a little bit of a disappointing season for Nate Oates in year one. You remember in the preseason, he went on my guy Aaron Torres' podcast and said, I would be very surprised if we don't make the NCAA tournament, you know, something to that extent. He thought Alabama would be good enough to make it, and I agreed with him. You know, talent-wise, they had Kyra Lewis, they had John Petty, had Herb Jones, and unfortunately they weren't really able to get that job done, had a number of just very frustrating losses. And even though that is the case, and even though those losses did occur last year, I think Alabama is actually in a really good spot to bounce back in 2020, 2021. When you look at the injuries that they really struggled with last year, both Josh Primo and Juwan Gary, two guys that tore their ACL in the preseason, should both be back. Right now, Alabama is currently waiting on the draft decisions of Petty and Jones. If both come back, Alabama, I think, should start the season as a top 20, top 25 team. Unfortunately, Kyra Lewis will no longer be there, but Alabama kind of expected that as a program. He was 50-50 to return to school the offseason prior. And the other kid I love for this Alabama team is Jaden Shackelford. This kid's going to be one of their starting guards. Just an electric player. Really showed some nice flashes last year. I trust Nate Oates as a coach. I think Bama's going to be right in the mix in the SEC. I think Arkansas, especially if Isaiah Joe does come back to school, will be in the mix as well. You guys know I'm a big fan of Eric Musselman. They also bring in Vance Jackson, the transfer from Connecticut. And Eric Musselman last year, look, I understand Arkansas had a bunch of frustrating losses and didn't really, you know, they had such a good start. And when you compare what the expectations were after their first, you know, couple games, they went into Georgia Tech and won. They went into Assembly Hall and Indiana and won. You know, Arkansas was a little disappointing when you compare how their conference season went. And you compare that to the way their non-conference season went. But I do think, like, at the same time, they did have a lot of things to build on. You know, they were playing 6 guys last year and didn't really have a true big man. This year, that changes with Connor Vanover being eligible, along with Jackson. Hopefully, Isaiah Joe comes back. You'll have Desi Sills back as well. You have J.D. Noti, the transfer, who could really score the ball as well. I trust Eric Musselman, especially with that talent, to get the job done. LSU is another team that should probably be an NCAA tournament team next year. They definitely lose Emmett Williams. It's looking like they're going to be losing Trendon Watford as well. Right now, Javonte Smart is 50-50 on the draft. They're going to have Sharif O'Neal. I don't really know how effective he'll be, but that is a name that everyone knows. And Will Wade is a good coach, man. He's a good recruiter. He knows how to bring in talent. LSU, I don't want to say once again that they were disappointing this past season, but at the same time, they did have a lot of talent. They weren't great, and a lot of that talent, unfortunately, for the Tigers is no longer there. When you look at Skylar Mays, and you look at Watford, who was, he's going to leave for the draft. I don't necessarily know if I agree with his decision of leaving. I think if he would have stayed for one more year, he could have really raised his stock. But that's not me to say, man. He had a really good and productive season last year for LSU. I think the Tigers will be right in the mix. Another team I think will be in the mix is Auburn. They are another team that loses a decent amount. Samir Dowdy no longer there. Same with Isaac Okoro. He's going to be a lottery pick. But Auburn does bring back a solid group of guys in Javon McCormick, in Sharif Cooper, the freshman. He's going to be one of their better players. And Bruce Pearl has really turned into one of the more consistent coaches in the SEC. I think Auburn will be right at the top of the mix in the SEC next year. You also have Florida, who, I spoke about Andrew Nebhart a little earlier on this show. And when you look at Florida, on paper, I think they should be pretty good. I like Quiz Glover. I thought he really provided Florida with some nice energy and impact off the bench, especially towards the back end of last season. You have a shooter in Noah Locke. Hopefully you have Trey Mann, an athletic guard, back. Scotty Lewis is definitely coming back on the wing. Keontae Johnson was one of your more consistent and productive players last year. Omar Payne showed some flashes. So for the second year in a row, Florida does have a lot of good pieces on paper, but at the same time, I'm never really going to trust that team to do anything if Mike White is still in charge, because he's just inconsistent for me, and he's had way too many disappointing losses over the last couple seasons. So Florida should be in the mix, but I'll never trust them to really get over the hump until I see it with my own eyes. And finally, the other team I wanted to mention quickly is Missouri. The Tigers were a little disappointing last season, and it's funny, last preseason, there were people that had some expectations on the Missouri Tigers, and I was not one of them. I just didn't really see anything, and it's not really like I didn't see anything this past season either, but at the same time, they do have some talent, and they bring back basically their whole team. And for me, you guys know, one of the things I really look at with teams and how I judge them in college basketball is how much talent they're bringing back from the season prior. And I think when you look at Konzo Martin, I'm not the biggest fan of him. I think he's a good recruiter, but hasn't really been able to translate that talent that he's been able to bring into wins. And I think this is a big season for him in Columbia. I don't know how most Missouri fans do feel about him. I'll tell you what, though, if I was a Missouri fan, I wouldn't really be that confident, but at the same time, this Missouri team should probably be the best team in their program since they got to the NCAA tournament a couple years ago when Michael Porter and Jonte Porter were there and Michael got hurt, but they were still able to make the NCAA tournament. So I think Missouri is kind of like my sleeper team to watch in the SEC. You also have A&M under Buzz Williams, who should be pretty solid. Kermit Davis and Ole Miss bring in Romello White and bring back a bunch of guys from their squad last year. So even though the league was a little down last year, I'm looking forward to see what the SEC could do in 2020, 2021. And it's cool to see a league that mostly is known for football to have a little bit of this turnaround in the basketball end of things. And, the SEC tournament's really fun. You guys know how crazy Kentucky's fans get, and it's cool when they have a rival or a fan base that could match up with them, like Tennessee did a couple years ago, like Florida has done in the past, like Arkansas has done in the past. So I love SEC basketball. It's one of my favorite conferences to cover. And even though they had a down 2020, I think they'll be right back in the mix in 2021.